Hey y'all, tonight we descend into the shadowy depths of a medieval castle dungeon, a place where the air is thick, the walls sweat, and your every sense is about to be tested. Imagine you're standing at the threshold, the massive oak door groaning open on rusty hinges, a torch flickering in the gloom. The stone beneath your feet is slick with centuries of condensation, and the only thing more oppressive than the darkness is the smell. A pungent cocktail of mildew, old straw, and something you'd rather not identify. You take a cautious step forward, the heavy air pressing against your skin, and it hits you. You probably won't survive this night, let alone a whole day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you braving this dungeon at midnight, or is it a sunny afternoon where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward, the torchlight barely illuminating the walls, which are lined with moss and the occasional suspicious stain. The air is so damp, you can practically taste the centuries-old despair. Every sound echoes. Your footsteps, your heartbeat, the distant drip drip of water leaking through the stones. You wonder, briefly, if you'll ever see sunlight again. Spoiler, most didn't. The castle above bustles with life, lords feasting, knights sharpening swords, servants scurrying, but down here, time stands still. You're in a world apart, where the rules of polite society are replaced by the law of survival. Historians still argue whether dungeons were meant for punishment, ransom, or simply to terrify would-be troublemakers. But one thing's for sure, comfort was not on the agenda. You reach out to steady yourself against the wall and instantly regret it. The stones are clammy, and something squishes beneath your palm. Mold, probably, or maybe the remnants of a previous tenant's last meal. You try not to think about it. Instead, your mind drifts to a quirky tidbit. Some medieval castles actually piped in fresh air using primitive ventilation shafts, but most dungeons were designed to be as inhospitable as possible. If you're waiting for a gentle breeze, you'll be waiting a long time. A rat, yes, an actual rat, scurries across your path, pausing to glare at you with beady eyes before disappearing into a crack in the wall. It's about the size of a kitten, and you make a mental note to keep your toes tucked in when you finally collapse on the straw. If you're lucky, you'll get a corner to yourself. If not, well, you'll learn to share. You hear a muffled groan from deeper within the dungeon. The sound raises the hairs on your neck. Was that a prisoner, or just the wind playing tricks? The acoustics in these stone chambers are notoriously deceptive. Some say the architects did it on purpose, amplifying every moan and cry to unnerve both captives and guards alike. Historians still debate whether this was intentional psychological warfare or just a happy accident of medieval engineering. You shuffle past a row of iron rings bolted to the wall. They're cold and rusty, but you can't help but imagine what it would feel like to be chained here, hour after hour, day after day. The reality check hits hard. you're not just visiting, you're surviving, or at least trying to. The stories you've heard about medieval dungeons, torture, starvation, madness, suddenly feel very real. And you haven't even found your bed yet. You glance upward, hoping for a glimpse of the sky, but the only thing above you is a low, vaulted ceiling dripping with condensation. Some dungeons were so deep underground that not even the faintest shaft of sunlight could penetrate. Others, surprisingly, were built in towers or above ground, visible to everyone as a grim warning. The term dungeon itself comes from the French donjon, meaning the main tower or keep. It's a common misconception that all dungeons were subterranean hellholes. Sometimes, the worst punishment was being locked away in plain sight, where everyone could watch you waste away. A guard passes by, keys jangling, and gives you a look that says, "Don't get any ideas." You try to muster a smile, but your lips are dry and cracked. Water is a luxury here, and you're already parched. You wonder how long you'll last before thirst overtakes you. Fun fact, some prisoners survived on nothing but the condensation they could lick from the walls. Not exactly Evian, but desperate times call for desperate measures. You settle onto a patch of straw, if you can call it that. It's more dust than bedding, and it smells like it's been fermenting since the reign of King John. You try to get comfortable, but every movement sends a cloud of dust and fleas into the air. You scratch at your ankle and discover your first bite. Congratulations, you're officially part of the ecosystem now. As you close your eyes, you hear the distant clang of a portcullis, the shuffle of feet, and the low murmur of voices plotting escape or simply trying to remember what fresh air smells like. You wonder if you'll dream of freedom tonight, or if the dungeon will seep into your subconscious, filling your sleep with nightmares of iron chains and endless darkness. The morning light, if you can call the dim gray filtering through a single arrow-slit light, reveals the truth about your new accommodations. You're not actually underground at all. Surprise! You've been bamboozled by centuries of Hollywood dramatization. Most medieval dungeons were actually located in the upper floors of castle towers, specifically in what the French called the donjon, the main keep or stronghold. You're essentially in a medieval penthouse, except instead of a view of the city, you get a bird's eye view of your own impending doom. This architectural revelation would be fascinating if you weren't currently contemplating whether that suspicious brown stain on the wall is rust or something far more organic. The irony isn't lost on you. Prisoners were often held in the most secure part of the castle, the very heart of the fortress, surrounded by thick walls and loyal guards. It's like being imprisoned in the CEO's office, if the CEO happened to be a bloodthirsty medieval lord with a penchant for creative punishment. You crane your neck toward that narrow window, barely wide enough for an arrow, let alone a human body, and realize why this placement was so diabolically clever. Everyone in the courtyard below can see this tower. They know you're up here, rotting away, serving as a living billboard for what happens when you cross the wrong nobleman. It's medieval marketing at its finest. Mess with us, and you too can enjoy our premium accommodations with a view. The stone walls around you are easily 6 feet thick in some places. You run your hand along the surface and feel the individual chisel marks where masons shaped each block centuries ago. These weren't just walls, they were statements of power designed to withstand siege engines and catapults. The fact that they're now keeping you in rather than keeping enemies out is just a delicious bit of medieval multitasking. Here's a quirky tidbit that would make you laugh if you weren't so busy trying not to cry. Some of these tower dungeons were originally designed as luxury apartments for important guests. The same room where you're now contemplating your mortality might have once hosted visiting dignitaries, complete with tapestries, braziers, and actual furniture. Talk about a property value crash. One day, you're sipping wine with the Earl. The next, you're sharing your breakfast gruel with a family of particularly aggressive mice. You notice iron rings embedded in the walls at various heights, some at ankle level, others at wrist height. The metal has been worn smooth by countless chains and shackles, polished by the desperate movements of previous occupants. Historians still argue whether these restraints were primarily for security or torture. But honestly, when you're the one potentially wearing them, the distinction feels pretty academic. The ceiling above you is vaulted, an architectural feature that serves multiple purposes. It distributes the weight of the floors above, creates an acoustic chamber that amplifies every sound, including your own increasingly labored breathing, and provides convenient anchor points for various unpleasant devices. Medieval engineers were nothing if not efficient with their cruelty. You discover that your tower prison has multiple levels, connected by a narrow spiral staircase that winds upward into darkness. Each floor housed different categories of prisoners: political captives, debtors, common criminals, and the occasional unfortunate soul who simply looked at someone the wrong way. It was like a vertical neighborhood of the damned, complete with its own social hierarchy and unwritten rules of survival. The most valuable prisoners, those worth substantial ransoms, enjoyed the penthouse suites at the top of the tower, better ventilation, more light, and occasionally even a servant to empty their chamber pot. You, unfortunately, appear to be somewhere in the middle floors, which suggests you're worth keeping alive, but not worth keeping comfortable. It's the medieval equivalent of coach class, except the peanuts are moldy and the flight attendants carry swords. A fascinating historical fact emerges as you explore your vertical prison. Many of these tower dungeons were originally built as symbols of prestige rather than practical fortifications. The higher the tower, the more impressive the lord's status. Some nobles competed to build the tallest donjon in the region, creating what medieval historians call tower envy. Your suffering is literally a byproduct of architectural one-upmanship. You peer down the spiral staircase and notice how the steps are worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, guards making their rounds, prisoners being dragged up and down, and the occasional escape attempt that ended badly. The stairs are deliberately uneven, designed to trip up attackers in the dark. Unfortunately, they're just as effective at tripping up prisoners trying to navigate to the communal latrine in the middle of the night. The walls are covered with graffiti from previous occupants, scratched names, dates, crude drawings, and the occasional philosophical observation about the nature of justice. Some of these inscriptions date back centuries, creating an inadvertent historical record of human misery. You run your finger over a carving that reads, "Thomas was here, 1347, and wonder if Thomas ever made it out, or if his bones are still somewhere in these walls. As you settle back onto your straw, you realize that this tower design was psychologically brilliant. You're simultaneously isolated from the world below and completely visible to it. You can hear the sounds of normal life, merchants hawking their wares, children playing, horses clopping across cobblestones, but you can't participate. It's the medieval equivalent of being ghosted, except the ghost is you, and you're haunting your own life from 6 stories up. You wake groggy, stiff, and itching in places you'd rather not mention. The first thing you notice, besides the delightful aroma of damp stone and regret, is your bed. If you were expecting a feather mattress, you're in for a medieval reality check. Your sleeping arrangement is a lumpy pile of straw, flattened and blackened by years of previous occupants. You try to shift your weight, but every movement releases a small cloud of dust, and something gitters away beneath you. Congratulations. You've just met your first cellmate, and it's not even human. Straw bedding was the norm for prisoners, and if you're lucky, it's replaced once a year, usually in spring, when the castle's livestock get their own fresh straw. The rest of the time, you're stuck with whatever blend of mold, insects, and mystery stains the last guy left behind. Historians still argue whether prisoners were provided with extra straw in winter, but the consensus is that comfort was never the priority. In fact, the filthier the bed, the less likely you are to get a good night's sleep, which is sort of the point. You scratch your arm and come away with a tiny, wriggling flea. Welcome to the medieval ecosystem, where lice, fleas, and bedbugs are as much a part of the furniture as the straw itself. These little critters aren't just annoying, they're dangerous. Fleas, for instance, are infamous for spreading diseases like the plague. You try not to think about that as you flick another one off your ankle. Fun fact, some prisoners would light small fires or candles under their bedding, hoping the smoke would drive the bugs away. It rarely worked, but it did make the straw extra flammable. So, pick your poison. You roll over, hoping for a fresh patch, and instead find a damp spot that's suspiciously warm. Is it water from the leaky ceiling, or did your predecessor leave you a little gift? The ambiguity is part of the charm. You make a mental note to sleep with your mouth closed. Sleeping on your back is a gamble, but so is curling up on your side. The straw pokes through your clothes, and you're pretty sure you just heard a mouse squeak in protest. As you settle in, you notice the straw is alive with movement. Bedbugs, those tiny vampires of the medieval world, are everywhere. They bite, they crawl, and they multiply with alarming speed. Some prisoners tried to keep them at bay by sleeping in their clothes, but the bugs always found a way. There's a fringe theory that prisoners would rub garlic or onion on their skin to repel insects. Historians still debate whether this worked or just made everyone smell even worse. You try to distract yourself by counting the cracks in the ceiling, but the itching is relentless. You remember reading somewhere that medieval prisoners sometimes braided the cleaner strands of straw into makeshift pillows or even little dolls to pass the time. It's a small act of defiance, finding comfort where none is offered. You consider giving it a try, but the idea of handling the straw any more than necessary makes your skin crawl. The cell is cold, and the straw offers little insulation. In winter, prisoners huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat, and unfortunately, their personal supply of lice. You hear a sneeze from the next cell over and wonder if the drafty stone walls will keep you safe from illness. Spoiler, they won't. The dampness seeps into your bones and you shiver, pulling your thin blanket tighter. If you're lucky, it's wool. If not, it's just another layer of scratchy, bug-infested misery. You try to find a comfortable position, but the uneven floor and lumpy straw make it impossible. Every time you close your eyes, you're jolted awake by a new itch or the sensation of something crawling across your skin. You wonder how anyone managed to sleep at all in these conditions. The answer, of course, is exhaustion. Eventually, your body gives in and you drift into a restless, dreamless sleep, if only for a few minutes at a time. There's a certain camaraderie in shared suffering. You hear your fellow prisoners grumbling about their own beds, trading stories of the worst infestations and the rare occasions when a kind guard brought in fresh straw. It's a bleak sort of humor, but it helps pass the time. You make a joke about starting a flea circus, and for a moment, the laughter echoes through the stone corridors. It's not much, but it's something. As you lie there, scratching and shivering, you realize that your bed is more than just a place to sleep. It's a test of endurance. Every night is a battle against the elements, the insects, and your own growing despair. You wonder how many prisoners broke not from torture or starvation, but simply from the relentless discomfort of their own bedding. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of these conditions, but you're living proof that it's enough to drive anyone mad. So, as you finally drift off, surrounded by the soft rustle of straw and the occasional squeak of a passing rat, you make a silent vow. If you ever get out of here, you'll never complain about your mattress again. Your stomach rumbles, reminding you that medieval dungeons weren't just prisons of stone and straw. They were also prisons of hunger. You shuffle toward the tiny, barred opening in the door, where a wooden tray slides in with today's offering. You peer down at it and try not to gag. A bowl of watery gruel, a piece of stale bread that's more rock than loaf, and a thin, cloudy broth that smells faintly of old beef and despair. Medieval prison food was designed with one goal in mind: keep you barely alive. Gruel, a thin porridge made from oats or barley, was the staple. It was cheap, filling, and easy to prepare in bulk, but it was also bland, nutritionally poor, and often contaminated by the very conditions you're trying to survive. You poke at the gruel with a finger, watching the watery mixture ripple. It's not exactly a Michelin star meal, but it's better than nothing. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castles had dedicated prison cooks, but their job was less about culinary excellence and more about ration control. They'd sometimes sneak in a few extra crumbs for favored prisoners or those who bribed the guards. Historians still argue whether these cooks were complicit in prisoner mistreatment or quietly sympathetic. Either way, your chances of a gourmet meal are slim. You dip your finger into the broth and taste it cautiously. It's salty and vaguely meaty, but mostly it tastes like the bottom of a rusty pot. You remember reading that medieval broths were often made from scraps, bones, gristle, and the occasional bit of offal, boiled until nothing but flavorless gelatin remained. It's a reminder that in this dungeon, even your food is a punishment. As you nibble the bread, you notice it's riddled with holes and hard enough to chip a tooth. Bread was a staple for peasants and prisoners alike, but the quality varied wildly. Sometimes it was baked with sawdust or ground up nutshells to stretch the dough. You try not to think about what else might be hiding in the crumb. The last thing you want is to swallow a medieval surprise. The meal is barely enough to keep your strength up, and you quickly realize that hunger here isn't just a discomfort, it's a constant, gnawing presence. Your body begins to slow, your mind foggy with fatigue. The irony is cruel. The dungeon is designed to break you physically and mentally, and starvation is one of its most effective tools. You glance around and notice the other prisoners eyeing their meals with similar resignation. Some try to trade bits of bread or gruel, hoping to improve their lot. Others simply stare into space, too weak or too defeated to eat. The social dynamics around food are as complex as the castle's political intrigues. Sharing might mean survival, but it also means vulnerability. A fascinating historical fact: during sieges, castles often rationed food strictly, and prisoners were sometimes deliberately starved to extract confessions or force compliance. Hunger was a weapon as much as the sword. Some prisoners resorted to desperate measures, like eating rats or even their own clothing. Historians still debate how common these extremes were, but the evidence is chilling. You try to savor what little sustenance you have, but the taste is bitter and the texture unpleasant. You remind yourself that this meal is a lifeline, however meager. It's a stark contrast to the lavish feasts happening just floors above, where lords and ladies dine on roasted boar and fine wine. The gulf between privilege and punishment couldn't be wider. As you finish your meal, you notice the tray is quickly whisked away, leaving you alone with your hunger and your thoughts. You wonder how long you can endure this cycle of starvation and misery. The answer, you suspect, is not long, but for now, you focus on the small victories, like not dropping your bread into the dirt or spilling your broth. You lean back against the cold stone wall, feeling the weight of your empty stomach and the persistent itch of your straw bed. You try to imagine a future beyond these walls, one where food is plentiful and your bed is soft. It's a comforting thought, but one that feels as distant as the stars you can't see through your narrow window. So, as you close your eyes and listen to the distant sounds of castle life, you remind yourself this gruel may be thin, but your will to survive is anything but. You're just starting to accept your meager meal as the new normal when you hear a faint scratching from the shadows. At first, you hope it's just your imagination, but then you spot a pair of beady eyes glinting in the dim light. Meet your most persistent cellmates, the rats. And these aren't your average cartoon rodents. These are medieval black rats, bold as brass, and roughly the size of kittens. The rats are everywhere, darting from cracks in the walls, scurrying across the straw, and occasionally pausing to size you up as if debating whether you're friend, foe, or future snack. You quickly learn to keep your bread close and your toes even closer. Historians still argue whether the rat populations in dungeons were as bad as the legends suggest. But judging by the nightly stampede across your bed, you're inclined to believe the worst. There's a certain hierarchy among the rats, too. The big ones claim the choicest scraps, your leftover gruel, the crusts of bread, and anything edible that hits the floor. The smaller ones make do with crumbs and whatever they can steal from the inattentive. You catch yourself naming a particularly bold rat Sir Squeaks-a-Lot, if only to give your misery a touch of humor. It's either that or start talking to the walls. Here's a quirky tidbit that's almost too gruesome to be true. In some dungeons, rats were more than just pests. They were part of the torture. There are accounts of guards placing a metal bucket filled with hungry rats on a prisoner's bare stomach, then heating the bucket from above. The rats, desperate to escape, would gnaw through flesh to get out. Historians still debate whether this was a widespread practice or a bit of medieval scare propaganda, but you eye the rats with new suspicion all the same. You try to defend your territory, shooing the rodents away with your hands or a stick, but they're persistent. They know the rhythms of the dungeon better than any guard. When the lights dim and the guards retreat, the rats come out in force, searching for food and warmth. Sometimes you wake in the night to the unsettling sensation of whiskers brushing your skin or tiny claws scampering across your chest. You learn quickly to sleep with your mouth closed and your blanket tucked tight. The rats aren't just a nuisance, they're a health hazard. They carry fleas and disease, and their droppings contaminate what little food and water you have. It's a constant battle to keep your space even remotely clean, and most days you lose. You remember a historical fact. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe, was spread in part by fleas hitching rides on rats just like these. You try not to dwell on that as you flick another flea from your sleeve. Despite their reputation, the rats are survivors, just like you. They adapt, they scavenge, and they thrive in the darkest corners of the castle. You can't help but feel a grudging respect for their tenacity. After all, you're both just trying to make it through another day in this stone-walled nightmare. You overhear a fellow prisoner muttering about a rat king, a tangled knot of rats whose tails have become fused together, forming a grotesque, writhing mass. It sounds like something out of a fever dream, but there are actual historical reports of such creatures being found in old buildings. Historians still debate whether these stories are exaggerated or if rat kings really did haunt the dungeons of Europe. Either way, you're not eager to find out firsthand. At meal times, the rats are boldest, darting in to snatch crumbs before you can react. You develop a system. Eat quickly, guard your food, and never leave leftovers unattended. It's a game of survival, and the rats are winning. You joke with your neighbors about opening a rat circus or training them as messengers, but deep down, you know the only thing these rats deliver is misery. As night falls and the dungeon grows quiet, the rats become your constant companions. Their squeaks and scurrying fill the silence, a reminder that you're never truly alone in this place. You wonder if, centuries from now, archaeologists will find the bones of prisoners and rats tangled together in the dust, an eternal testament to the struggle for survival. So you pull your blanket tighter, close your eyes, and hope that tonight the rats will be content with crumbs and leave your toes alone. You're lying awake, listening to the rats' midnight parade, when your mind drifts to the infamous Iron Maiden. You've seen it in movies, a human-shaped coffin lined with spikes, ready to impale anyone unlucky enough to be locked inside. Surely, you think, this is the pinnacle of medieval cruelty. But as you eye the gloomy corners of your cell, you realize the truth is a bit more complicated and, in its own way, even more unsettling. Here's the big twist. The Iron Maiden, as we picture it today, probably never existed in the Middle Ages. Most historians agree it was a later invention, cobbled together from bits of myth, Victorian showmanship, and a healthy dose of human imagination. The first real Iron Maiden on record didn't appear until the late 18th or early 19th century, when museums and sideshows were eager to cash in on the public's appetite for gruesome relics. So, if you're waiting for a guard to wheel in a spiked sarcophagus, you can breathe a tiny sigh of relief, at least for now. That's not to say medieval dungeons lacked creativity. Torture was very real, but the devices were often less theatrical and more practical. Racks, thumbscrews, and chains did the job just fine. The Iron Maiden, with its dramatic spikes and hinged doors, was more a product of Gothic imagination than actual medieval engineering. Historians still argue whether any maiden was ever used for torture or if it was simply a macabre display piece meant to shock and awe visitors centuries after the fact. Still, the myth persists. You picture yourself standing before the Iron Maiden, its rusty jaws open wide, the spikes gleaming in the torchlight. It's the stuff of nightmares. And maybe that's the point. The power of the Iron Maiden isn't in its reality, but in its legend, the fear it inspires, the stories it spawns. Even now, lying on your moldy straw bed, you can't quite shake the image. Here's a quirky tidbit. The most famous Iron Maiden was displayed in Nuremberg in the 1800s, complete with a dramatic backstory and a set of spikes that looked suspiciously modern. It drew crowds and headlines, but most experts now believe it was assembled from old armor and wood, then retrofitted with spikes to create a spectacle. In other words, it was the medieval equivalent of clickbait, designed to shock, not to accurately reflect history. You share this revelation with your fellow prisoners, hoping to lighten the mood. At least we don't have to worry about being stuffed into a spiky coffin, you joke. Someone snorts. Yeah, we just have to worry about starving, freezing, and being eaten by rats. The laughter is grim, but genuine. Sometimes the only way to survive is to poke fun at the horrors you can't escape. Of course, just because the Iron Maiden is mostly myth doesn't mean you're safe. The real torture devices were often simpler, but no less effective. Chains, stocks, and the rack were all too real, and their scars lingered long after the wounds had healed. You remind yourself that in a place like this, the line between legend and reality is always blurry. You wonder why the Iron Maiden became so iconic. Maybe it's because it captures the essence of medieval fear, a punishment so cruel, so inescapable, it transcends time and place. Or maybe it's just because people love a good horror story. Historians still debate why some myths stick while others fade away. But one thing's for sure, the Iron Maiden isn't going anywhere, at least not in our collective imagination. As you drift off to sleep, you picture the Iron Maiden gathering dust in some forgotten corner of a museum, its spikes dulled by centuries of disuse. It's a relic of a past that never quite existed, but its shadow still falls across your dreams. You pull your blanket tighter and whisper a silent thanks that, for tonight at least, your nightmares are just that, nightmares. You wake to the clatter of keys and the heavy tread of boots echoing down the corridor. The guards are making their rounds, and with them comes the ever-present threat of the real medieval torture arsenal. Forget the Iron Maiden. What you actually need to worry about are the devices that didn't need spikes or dramatic flair to break a person, body, and soul. First up is the rack, a simple yet devastating contraption. You've heard the rumors, wrists and ankles tied, a crank turned, and your body stretched inch by inch until joints pop and muscles tear. It's a historical fact that the rack was used throughout Europe, especially for extracting confessions or information. The mere sight of it was often enough to make even the bravest prisoner rethink their secrets. Historians still argue whether the rack was a last resort or a routine tool, but you know you'd spill your guts at the first creak of the wood. Then there's the thumbscrew, a device so unassuming it could fit in a guard's pocket. It's a metal clamp that crushes your thumbs, or sometimes your big toes, slowly and methodically. The pain is excruciating, but it leaves few visible marks. You shudder, flexing your fingers as if to reassure yourself they're still intact. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some dungeons had deluxe thumbscrews with spikes inside, just in case the standard model wasn't persuasive enough. Medieval innovation at its most sadistic. Chains and manacles are everywhere, clinking from the walls and ceiling. Some are so heavy you can barely lift your arms, let alone escape. You notice the rust. Prisoners often developed infections from the constant chafing and the filthy metal. The chains serve a double purpose. They restrain you, and they remind you, with every movement, that you're not going anywhere. Historians still debate whether the psychological toll of these restraints was worse than the physical pain. Stocks and pillories, those wooden frames that clamp around your neck and wrists, are another favorite. You're forced to stand or sit in a humiliating position, exposed to the jeers and sometimes the rotten vegetables of anyone passing by. The stocks aren't just for punishment, they're for public shaming. You imagine the townsfolk laughing, children pointing, and realize that sometimes humiliation hurts more than any wound. Water torture is another tool in the dungeon's arsenal. Sometimes it's as simple as dripping water onto your forehead for hours, driving you slowly mad. Other times, it's more direct, dunking, forced drinking, or even simulated drowning. You've heard tales of prisoners who confess to anything just to make it stop. Historians still argue about the origins of these methods, but the effects are undeniable. The strapado is a particularly nasty device. Your hands are tied behind your back, and you're hoisted into the air by a rope attached to your wrists. The weight of your own body wrenches your shoulders out of their sockets. You can almost hear the pop and feel the agony. It's a punishment that leaves you alive, but barely. Here's a quirky detail. Some prisoners were dropped and yanked back up repeatedly just to prolong the suffering. Not all torture devices are mechanical. Sometimes it's as simple as starvation, isolation, or sleep deprivation. The guards know exactly how long you can go without food, water, or rest before you start to break. You overhear a guard boasting about his record, 3 days without sleep, and the prisoner was begging for mercy. The cruelty is as much psychological as it is physical. You notice a table in the corner covered with tools, pliers, tongs, branding irons. Each one has a story, a purpose, a victim. You wonder how many screams these stones have absorbed over the centuries. Some prisoners tried to resist, biting their tongues or refusing to speak. Others broke at the first touch. Historians still debate whether torture was effective for extracting truth or just a way to assert power. You glance at your fellow prisoners, each one marked in some way, scars, limps, haunted eyes. You realize that survival here isn't just about enduring pain. It's about holding on to your sense of self. The torture devices are designed to strip that away, piece by piece. You make a silent promise. Whatever happens, you'll try to keep a part of yourself untouched. As the guards move on, the dungeon settles into uneasy silence. You run your fingers over your wrists, grateful for the momentary reprieve. The arsenal of torture may be real, but so is your will to survive. For now, that's enough. The hours crawl by, and you become painfully aware that the worst torment isn't always inflicted by guards or devices. Sometimes it's simply the air you breathe. The assault on your senses is relentless, and you begin to realize that medieval dungeons were designed not just to imprison bodies, but to overwhelm minds and noses alike. The stench is the first thing that truly breaks you. It's a thick, sour blend of human waste, rotting straw, sweat, and mold, an aroma so dense you can almost see it hanging in the air. Every breath is a challenge. You try breathing through your mouth, but that just adds the taste of despair to the mix. Historians still argue whether dungeons were intentionally left filthy to punish prisoners, or if the conditions were simply a byproduct of neglect and overcrowding. Either way, you're not getting used to it. You shuffle to the corner where a battered wooden bucket sits. This, you realize, is your toilet. There's no privacy, no dignity, just you, your fellow captives, and the ever-present knowledge that the bucket will only be emptied when someone remembers or when it overflows. The result? Puddles of filth on the floor, the straw perpetually damp, and a smell that clings to your skin and hair. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some castles, prisoners were forced to empty their own buckets into cesspits, which were sometimes located directly beneath the dungeon. The sound and smell of waste dropping into the darkness below was a constant reminder of your place in the world. You try to focus on anything else, but your other senses aren't much comfort. The walls are slick with condensation, and the air is so humid that your clothes never quite dry, touching anything. Walls, straw, even your own skin leaves you feeling sticky and unclean. You remember reading that some dungeons had primitive drainage systems, little more than trenches cut into the stone to carry away the worst of the filth. Historians still debate how effective these were. Judging by your current predicament, you're inclined to say, not very. Sound is another tormentor. Every cough, groan, and whimper echoes endlessly, bouncing off the stone walls and making it impossible to tell where noises are coming from. Sometimes you hear the distant clatter of armor or the muffled sobs of another prisoner. Other times, it's the ceaseless drip of water, each drop a tiny reminder that time is passing. Slowly, painfully, you make a joke to yourself. If the rats don't get me, the acoustics will. Then there's the darkness. Even during the day, the light that filters through the tiny window is weak and watery. At night, it's absolute, a blackness so deep you lose all sense of space and time. Your eyes strain to adjust, but the shadows seem to move and shift, playing tricks on your mind. You remember that some prisoners, desperate for any distraction, would talk to the darkness, inventing stories or imaginary friends. Historians still argue whether sensory deprivation was a deliberate tactic or just a side effect of medieval architecture. You try to keep your spirits up, making light of the situation with your neighbors. At least we don't have to worry about sunburn, you quip, earning a tired chuckle. But the truth is, the constant assault on your senses wears you down. You become hyper-aware of every smell, every sound, every itch. It's a slow, grinding torture that leaves no marks but lingers long after the chains are gone. A fascinating historical fact: some dungeons were infamous for their unique smells. The Tower of London's Little Ease, for example, was so cramped and foul that prisoners could neither stand nor lie down, forced to crouch in their own filth for days. The stories of these places spread far and wide, serving as a warning to anyone tempted to break the law. The power of the dungeon wasn't just in its walls, but in its reputation, a reputation built on centuries of suffering and stench. As you lie back on your straw, you realize that survival here isn't just about enduring pain or hunger. It's about adapting to an environment that seems designed to break you in every possible way. You wonder how anyone managed to keep their sanity in such conditions. Historians still debate the long-term effects of sensory assault, but you're living proof that it's every bit as brutal as the rack or the thumbscrew. So you close your eyes, take a shallow breath, and try to imagine a world where the air is fresh, the light is bright, and the only thing you smell is freedom. You wake coughing, throat raw, lips cracked, and realize the dungeon's most effective executioner isn't a guard or a torture device. It's disease. In this world of moldy straw and fetid air, illness is as common as rats and far deadlier. You look around at your fellow prisoners, sunken eyes, sallow skin, the slow, shuffling gait of people who know their bodies are failing them. You suddenly understand why most prisoners didn't last long in these walls. The most common killer is simple infection. Any cut, maybe from a rusty shackle, maybe from scratching at flea bites, can fester in the filth. Without soap, clean water, or even the chance to wash your hands, wounds become angry, swollen, and ooze with pus. You remember a mainstream historical fact: before antibiotics, even a minor injury could spiral into sepsis, fever, and death. The dungeon's damp, close quarters are a breeding ground for bacteria, and you're painfully aware that your odds of survival drop with every new scratch. Then there's the coughing. Someone in the next cell hacks through the night, a deep, rattling sound that echoes off the stones. Tuberculosis, called consumption in those days, is rampant. The disease spreads quickly in confined, unventilated spaces, and you can almost feel the germs hanging in the air. You pull your ragged blanket up over your nose, but it's a feeble defense. Historians still argue whether outbreaks were ever truly contained, or if the dungeon was always just one long epidemic in slow motion. You spot a prisoner with a strange rash, red, blistered, and weeping. Maybe it's scabies, maybe it's something worse. Skin diseases flourish here, thanks to the constant damp and the never-ending parade of vermin. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some prisoners try to treat skin infections by rubbing on garlic or even animal fat, believing it would draw out the evil humors. Whether it helped or just made them smell even worse, historians still debate. Lice and fleas are more than an annoyance. They're a death sentence. They spread typhus, a disease that brings high fever, delirium, and a rash that covers the body. You remember reading that during outbreaks, entire dungeon populations could be wiped out in weeks. The guards, terrified of catching something themselves, often kept their distance, tossing food through the bars and refusing to enter unless absolutely necessary. You joke with your neighbor. At least the rats have job security as disease delivery specialists. The laughter is weak, but it helps. If you're unlucky enough to be chained in place, things get even worse. Bed sores form where metal presses against skin, and without movement, your muscles waste away. The sores can turn gangrenous, a word you never wanted to understand so intimately. The stench of rotting flesh mingles with the other dungeon odors, and you realize, with grim clarity, that death here is rarely quick or clean. You hear stories, half whispered, half imagined, about plague outbreaks. During the Black Death, some dungeons were simply abandoned, the doors barred from the outside to keep the infection from spreading. The prisoners were left to die, their bodies piling up until the disease burned itself out. Historians still debate how often this happened, but the fear lingers in every cough, every feverish shiver. Sometimes the only treatment is removal. If you're lucky, a priest or healer might be summoned to offer last rites or a herbal poultice. More often, the sick are simply left to die, their bodies dragged out at night and dumped in mass graves. You wonder if anyone will remember your name, or if you'll just become another anonymous skeleton beneath the castle floor. You try to keep your spirits up, making jokes about medieval healthcare. Take 2 leeches and call me in the morning. But the truth is, you're terrified. Every ache, every sniffle, every itch could be the start of something fatal. You cling to whatever scraps of hope you can find. A clean patch of straw, a cup of water that doesn't taste like mold, a day without fever. So you huddle in your corner, listening to the chorus of coughs and groans, and pray that tonight disease will pass you by. In this dungeon, survival is less about strength or cunning and more about sheer dumb luck. You lie awake, counting the hours by the distant clang of the castle's bells, and your mind inevitably drifts to escape. Surely, you think, someone must have broken out of a dungeon like this. Maybe you could be the one. If only you could get past the locks, the guards, the rats, and, well, everything else. But as you examine your surroundings, you begin to appreciate the genius of medieval security. Prison breaks weren't just rare, they were nearly impossible. First, there's the door itself, heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands and studded with rivets. The lock is a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, a complex mechanism designed to foil even the most determined thief. You remember a mainstream historical fact. Locksmiths in the Middle Ages were highly respected, often sworn to secrecy about their designs. Some locks had multiple tumblers, false keyholes, or hidden triggers. You run your fingers over the cold metal, searching for weakness, but find only centuries of stubborn resistance. Then there's the matter of the guards. They patrol in shifts, their boots echoing on the stone floors, keys jangling at their belts. You quickly realize there's never a moment when the corridor is truly empty. Guards are rotated regularly, and new faces replace the old before fatigue can set in. You overhear them grumbling about the night watch, but you also notice how alert they are. No one wants to be the one who lets a prisoner slip away. Historians still argue whether guards were always this diligent, or if the threat of severe punishment for negligence kept them on their toes. The architecture itself is a silent warden. The spiral staircase, which seemed like a simple design choice, is actually a clever trap. The steps are uneven and spiral clockwise, favoring right-handed defenders. Anyone trying to rush up the stairs with a weapon in their right hand would find their swing hampered by the central column. You imagine yourself trying to flee, only to trip and tumble back down into the waiting arms of your captors. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castles even built false doors or dead-end corridors to confuse would-be escapees. You wonder how many desperate souls spent their last moments running in circles, lost in a stone labyrinth. Windows, if you have one, are little more than slits, too narrow for a grown person to squeeze through, and too high up to reach without help. Even if you could somehow break the bars, you'd face a dizzying drop to the courtyard below, assuming you weren't spotted and shot with arrows before you hit the ground. You make a joke to yourself. If the fall doesn't kill you, the landing definitely will. You consider bribery. In stories, there's always a sympathetic guard willing to look the other way for the right price. But here, you have nothing to offer. No gold, no favors, not even a decent loaf of bread. Besides, the guards are as much prisoners of the system as you are. Any hint of collusion could mean torture or death for them too. Historians still debate how often bribery actually worked, but in your case, it's a non-starter. You listen to the stories whispered among the prisoners. There's always a legend of someone who dug a tunnel with a stolen spoon, or who disguised themselves as a guard and walked right out the front gate. But these tales are always secondhand, always from a friend of a friend. The reality is, most escape attempts ended in recapture, punishment, or worse. The castle was designed as a fortress, and the dungeon was its heart, a place where hope came to die. You try to imagine your own escape plan. Maybe you could feign illness, get moved to the infirmary, and slip away during the chaos. Maybe you could overpower a guard, steal his keys, and make a run for it. But every scenario ends the same way. Locked doors, alert guards, and nowhere to hide. The walls are too thick, the windows too small, the corridors too confusing. As you lie back on your straw, you realize that the true genius of the medieval dungeon wasn't just in its physical barriers, but in the way it crushed hope. Every detail, from the locks to the layout, was designed to make escape unthinkable. You're not just trapped by stone and iron, you're trapped by the knowledge that there's no way out. So you close your eyes, listen to the guard's footsteps fading down the hall, and let yourself dream, just for a moment, of freedom. Because in a place like this, sometimes dreams are the only escape you'll ever have. You're beginning to realize that the dungeon's most insidious weapon isn't the rack or the rats. It's the slow erosion of your mind. The longer you're here, the more the psychological torture seeps in, like the damp in the stones. Isolation, darkness, and uncertainty become your constant companions, gnawing at your sanity 1 hour at a time. At first, you try to keep track of the days. Maybe you scratch tally marks into the wall or count the irregular meals that slide through the hatch. But the routine blurs quickly. Was that breakfast or just another watery bowl of gruel? Is it morning or night? The tiny window offers only a sliver of gray sky, and even that is often lost to fog or rain. You joke with yourself, who needs a calendar when you've got mold patterns? The humor is thin, but it's a lifeline. You start to notice how the silence changes. Sometimes it's so complete you can hear your own heartbeat thudding in your ears. Other times, it's punctuated by distant screams, the clank of chains, or the low, desperate prayers of fellow prisoners. Historians still argue whether dungeons were intentionally designed to amplify these sounds. But either way, the effect is chilling. Every noise becomes a question. Who is suffering? Will it be you next? The darkness is a living thing. When the torches sputter out and the guards retreat, you're left in a blackness so deep it feels physical. Your eyes strain, inventing shapes in the gloom. A rat, a guard, something worse. You remember a quirky tidbit. Some prisoners swore they saw ghosts or demons in the shadows, their minds conjuring terrors from the void. Whether these were hallucinations or just tricks of the light, historians still debate. but you understand how easy it is to believe in monsters when the world is nothing but darkness and fear. Loneliness presses in. Even with other prisoners nearby, the sense of isolation is profound. Conversations are whispered, cautious, and often cut short by the threat of eavesdropping guards. You find yourself talking to the walls, to the rats, even to the moldy straw, anything to fill the silence, to remind yourself you're still here. You recall a historical fact. Solitary confinement, though not always formalized, was a common punishment for difficult prisoners. Some were locked away for months or years, emerging broken, their minds frayed by endless solitude. You try to hold on to memories of the outside world, sunlight on your skin, the sound of laughter, the taste of real food. But those memories fade, replaced by the daily grind of survival. You worry you'll forget your own name, your own story. You start repeating it to yourself like a mantra, a fragile thread tying you to the life you once knew. Sleep becomes both a refuge and a torment. Nightmares haunt you. Visions of endless corridors, locked doors, faces you can't quite remember. Sometimes you wake gasping, unsure if you're still dreaming. You joke to yourself, at least in my dreams, the straw isn't itchy. The laughter is hollow, but it keeps the darkness at bay for another moment. You notice the toll on others too. Some prisoners withdraw completely, staring at the wall for hours, unresponsive to anything around them. Others become agitated, pacing their cells, muttering to themselves, or lashing out in sudden bursts of anger. You realize that survival here isn't just about enduring hunger or pain. It's about protecting your mind from the slow, relentless assault of the dungeon itself. Historians still debate which broke more prisoners, the physical torture or the psychological torment. You suspect it's the combination, the way each amplifies the other, leaving you raw and vulnerable. You cling to small rituals, a whispered prayer, a joke with a neighbor, a moment spent tracing patterns in the straw. These become your anchors, your way of holding on to yourself in a place designed to erase you. So you close your eyes, take a deep breath, and remind yourself, you are still here. You are still you. And as long as you can remember that, the dungeon hasn't won. At least, not yet. You're getting used to the rhythm of dungeon life, if used to is even the right phrase for surviving on moldy straw and hope. But just when you think you've figured out the rules, you notice something else. Not all prisoners are treated equally. Even in this pit of misery, hierarchy reigns supreme. Your social class follows you right into the darkness, shaping your fate in ways you never imagined. You watch as a new prisoner arrives, his clothes finer, his hair cleaner, his posture still defiant. The guards treat him with a grudging respect, even as they lock him in a cell that's noticeably larger and closer to the window. You realize he's a nobleman, maybe a knight or a minor lord who's fallen from grace. His cell has a wooden bench, a thicker blanket, and, luxury of luxuries, a chamber pot that actually gets emptied. You joke to yourself, guess he's got the VIP package. The laughter from your neighbors is tinged with envy. It's a mainstream historical fact. Medieval society was rigidly stratified, and that didn't stop at the dungeon door. Nobles, clergy, and wealthy merchants were often imprisoned separately from commoners. Their cells were cleaner, their food less revolting, and their chances of survival much higher. Sometimes they were even allowed visitors, books, or letters from home. You, on the other hand, are lucky if the guard remembers to throw you a crust of bread. You overhear rumors of ransoms and negotiations. Important prisoners are valuable assets, chess pieces in the endless game of medieval politics. Their families might pay handsomely for their release, or their enemies might want them kept alive as leverage. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were more about money or power, but you see the results firsthand. The nobleman's cell is never truly dark, and his straw is always fresh. Meanwhile, the commoners, peasants, laborers, petty thieves are crammed together in the darkest, dampest cells. You share your misery with them, swapping stories and scraps of food. There's a rough camaraderie, but also a sense of resignation. You know that if disease breaks out, it will sweep through your ranks first. If food runs short, you'll be the last to eat. If torture is on the menu, you'll be called before the nobleman ever feels a chain. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some dungeons had an unofficial pecking order among prisoners. The strongest or most charismatic might claim the best sleeping spot, organize the sharing of food, or even negotiate with guards for small favors. Sometimes these cell bosses acted as protectors. Other times they were just another layer of oppression. Historians still debate how much power prisoners really had over their own fates. But you see the politics play out every day. You notice that even the guards play favorites. They chat with the nobleman, sometimes slipping him extra food or news from the outside. For the rest of you, it's indifference at best, cruelty at worst. You wonder if it's safer to keep your head down or try to curry favor, maybe by sharing a joke, maybe by offering a handmade trinket. But you know that in this place, trust is as scarce as clean water. There are moments of quiet rebellion. You see prisoners sharing what little they have, comforting the sick, or helping each other through the worst nights. It's a reminder that even in the darkest places, humanity persists. You joke with your cellmates. At least we don't have to worry about our chamber pots overflowing with gold. The laughter is genuine this time, a brief spark of warmth in the cold. You realize that survival here isn't just about strength or cunning. It's about navigating the invisible web of alliances and rivalries. The dungeon is a microcosm of the world above, with its own rules, its own winners and losers. You wonder if, given the chance, you'd trade places with the nobleman. Would a softer bed and better food be worth the constant fear of ransom or execution? Historians still argue which fate was crueler, but down here, every comfort feels like a victory. So you settle back onto your straw, grateful for the small kindnesses and wary of the shifting alliances. In the medieval dungeon, class may decide your cell, but character decides your company. And sometimes that's the only thing keeping you sane. You're starting to realize that every day in the dungeon is a series of impossible calculations. tiny acts of survival that add up to one big question. How long can you last? It's not just about enduring pain or hunger. It's about rationing your energy, your hope, and even your dignity with the kind of precision you never thought you'd need. First, there's food. You've learned to eat slowly, savoring each mouthful of bland gruel and stale bread. You stash crumbs in your pockets, not for later, but in case the rats get bold enough to demand a tax. You joke with your neighbors. It's like budgeting for a medieval diet plan. Lose weight, lose hope, lose your mind. The laughter is weak, but it helps. Historians still argue whether prisoners ever received enough calories to survive long term, or if slow starvation was simply part of the punishment. Water is another daily gamble. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's cloudy, always it's precious. You sip carefully, knowing that a single gulp could empty your cup for the day. You remember a quirky tidbit. Some prisoners tried to catch condensation from the walls, licking the cold stone at dawn for a few extra drops. It's not glamorous, but it's survival. Sleep is a luxury you can't afford to waste. Every noise, rat, guard, or groaning neighbor threatens to snap you awake. You learn to nap in short bursts, curled tight to conserve warmth and minimize your surface area for bugs to bite. You even develop a sixth sense for when it's safe to close your eyes. If the guards are quiet, you might risk a longer rest. If they're in a bad mood, you stay alert, ready to dodge a kick or a thrown bucket. Personal hygiene becomes a strategic operation. You scrape dirt from under your nails with a splinter of wood, wash your face with the least filthy water you can find, and shake out your straw bed to dislodge the worst of the bugs. You joke, spa day in the dungeon, mud masks and rat tail massages included. The sarcasm is all you have left. Then there's the matter of health. You monitor every ache, every cough, every new bite or rash. You trade tips with your fellow prisoners. Garlic for lice, salt for wounds, prayer for everything else. You know that a fever could mean the end, so you ration your strength, moving only when necessary and conserving energy for the truly important things, like fighting off a rat for your last crust of bread. Social dynamics are another daily calculation. You weigh the risks of sharing food or information. Knowing that trust is a rare commodity, you keep one eye on the guards and the other on your neighbors, always alert for shifts in the fragile balance of power. Historians still debate whether solidarity or suspicion was the better survival strategy, but you suspect it's a bit of both. You even ration your hope too much, and disappointment will crush you. Too little, and despair will drag you under. You cling to small victories, a clean cup of water, a warm patch of sunlight, a joke that makes someone smile. These moments become your currency, traded for another hour, another day. You notice how the dungeon changes people. Some become leaders, organizing the cell, negotiating with guards, or protecting the weak. Others withdraw, hoarding scraps and trust alike. You wonder which you're becoming, and whether you'll recognize yourself if you ever see daylight again. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Some prisoners kept themselves sane by creating routines, prayers at dawn, stories at dusk, exercises in the narrow space between chains. These rituals became lifelines, proof that you could still choose how to spend your time, even if your choices were desperately limited. As you lie back, counting the cracks in the ceiling, you realize that survival isn't about brute strength or cleverness. It's about the daily math of misery, balancing your needs, your fears, and your fleeting moments of hope. Historians still argue which was the most important, but you know the truth. In the dungeon, every calculation is a matter of life and death. So you close your eyes, take a careful breath, and prepare to do it all again tomorrow. Because in this place, survival is the only game, and the rules change every day. You find yourself drifting into daydreams, sometimes of escape, sometimes just of a world that isn't made of stone and shadows. But your mind inevitably wanders to a comparison. How does this medieval nightmare stack up against the prisons of today? The answer is both comforting and a little bit horrifying. If you think modern lockup is tough, you haven't spent a day in a medieval dungeon. You picture a modern prison, fluorescent lights, metal bunks, maybe a TV bolted to the wall, and guards in crisp uniforms. There are rules, routines, and, believe it or not, rights. You might even get 3 meals a day, access to a shower, and a library card if you play your cards right. It's not exactly a spa, but compared to your current accommodations, it's a 5-star resort. Historians still argue whether today's prisons are too lenient or too harsh. But one thing's for sure, they're designed with at least a nod to human dignity. Here, in your medieval cell, dignity is a distant memory. There's no privacy, no medical care, and no hope of parole. Your bed is a bug-ridden pile of straw. Your bathroom is a bucket, and your meals are designed to keep you alive. Barely. If you get sick, you're on your own. If you're attacked, you'd better hope your neighbors like you. The only rehabilitation on offer is the slow grind of misery and despair. You remember a mainstream historical fact. The concept of prison as a place for rehabilitation is a relatively modern invention. In the Middle Ages, imprisonment was usually a temporary measure, just long enough to arrange a ransom, a confession, or an execution. Punishments were public and immediate: stocks, floggings, or a quick trip to the gallows. The dungeon was for those who needed to be broken, forgotten, or used as a warning to others. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the earliest modern prisons, like London's Bridewell, were originally workhouses for the poor and vagrants. They introduced ideas like hard labor, solitary confinement, and even rudimentary education. Historians still debate whether these reforms were acts of mercy or just new forms of control, but they marked the beginning of a shift away from pure punishment towards something resembling rehabilitation. You think about the legal rights prisoners have today: access to lawyers, appeals, and medical care. In the dungeon, your only advocate is luck, and your only appeal is to the mercy of your captors. There are no visits, no letters, no hope of a fair trial. If you're important, someone might negotiate for your release. If not, you're just another nameless soul lost to the darkness. The architecture itself tells the story. Modern prisons are designed for surveillance and control, with clear sight lines and secure perimeters. Medieval dungeons, by contrast, are designed to disappear people, to erase them from the world above. The walls are thick, the doors heavy, and the windows, if any, are little more than slits. You realize that the greatest cruelty of the dungeon isn't just the suffering, it's the utter isolation. You make a joke to yourself. At least in a modern prison, you can complain about the food on social media. The absurdity makes you smile, even as you scrape another bug off your ankle. You wonder what future generations will think of today's prisons and whether they'll look back on them with the same horror you feel for this place. Historians still argue whether society has truly learned from the past or if we're just finding new ways to punish and control. But as you lie back on your straw, you know one thing for certain. You wouldn't last a day in a medieval dungeon, and you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. So you close your eyes, grateful for every small mercy the modern world has to offer, and hope that someday no one will ever have to endure a place like this again. You sense it now, the weight of the dungeon pressing in, the finality of stone and iron, the way hope flickers and fades with each passing hour. Yet, as you lie there, you realize that even the darkest cell can't completely extinguish the human spirit. Somewhere deep inside, a stubborn ember of resilience glows. You cling to it because in this place, imagination is the only escape that's truly yours. You listen to the shuffle of feet, the distant clang of a portcullis, and the soft, almost soothing hum of the rats as they settle in for the night. The castle above is winding down, the revelry replaced by the hush of sleep. For a moment, the dungeon feels almost peaceful. If you ignore the damp, the cold, and the ever-present ache in your bones, you let your mind wander, picturing the world beyond these walls, green fields, sunlight on your face, the laughter of friends. It's a fragile daydream, but it's enough to carry you through another hour. You remember the stories you've heard of prisoners who survived not because they were the strongest, but because they found ways to keep hope alive. Maybe it was a song, a prayer, or a whispered promise to see the sky again. Maybe it was the camaraderie of cellmates, or the stubborn refusal to let the dungeon define them. Historians still argue which mattered more, luck, faith, or sheer willpower. But you know that in the end, survival here is a patchwork of all three. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some prisoners, denied pen and paper, scratched poetry into the walls with bits of bone or metal. Centuries later, those words remain, a testament to the fact that even in the bleakest places, people reach for meaning, for connection, for something beautiful. You run your fingers over a faded inscription and wonder about the person who carved it and whether they ever found freedom. As the night deepens, you notice the subtle rituals that help you and your neighbors endure. Someone hums a lullaby from their childhood. Another tells a story, voice low and soothing. You share a joke about the rats organizing a union, and for a moment, laughter echoes through the stone. These small acts of rebellion, of claiming joy in a place built for misery, are what keep you tethered to yourself. You realize that, for all its horrors, the dungeon can't erase your memories, your dreams, or your sense of humor. It can't stop you from imagining a better tomorrow or from finding solace in the company of others. Even as you shiver on your straw bed, you hold on to the hope that someday you'll walk free beneath the sun. So you close your eyes, listening to the quiet symphony of the dungeon at night, and let yourself drift toward sleep. In your dreams, the walls melt away, and you run, unburdened, unbroken, into the light. Now, let your breath slow. The dungeon's echoes begin to fade, replaced by the gentle hush of your own room. Picture the stone walls softening, the damp air giving way to a warm, gentle breeze. The straw beneath you transforms into the comfort of your own bed, clean and safe. Each sound, the drip of water, the distant shuffle of feet, becomes softer, more distant, until it's just a memory dissolving into the quiet. You are far from those cold, shadowy corridors. The aches and itches of the dungeon slip away, replaced by the warmth of your blanket and the steady rhythm of your heartbeat. You remember that you are free, free to move, to breathe deeply, to stretch out and relax. The world outside is calm, and you are safe within it. Let your mind drift to gentle places, sunlight filtering through leaves, the soft murmur of a peaceful stream, the laughter of friends in the distance. Feel the tension in your body melt away, each muscle relaxing, each worry loosening its grip. You are not trapped. You are at home, surrounded by comfort, with nothing to fear. As sleep begins to claim you, hold on to the knowledge that the darkness of the dungeon is far behind. You are strong, resilient, and safe. Let your dreams carry you somewhere bright and beautiful, where freedom is as close as your next breath.